Welcome to my show, When Everyone Wins, where a key goal I have for you is shifting from power over and under to power within and between. I'm your host, Judy Ryan. In each episode, I'll share my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWorks Systems. I'll help you build trust and emotional and social intelligence. My show, When Everyone Wins, is about creating a life you love and helping others do the same. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our show, When Everyone Wins. Today's show is going to be on embracing humanity. It's the crucial shift that's needed right now. And I want to start by telling you that I met my guest for this show when he read one of my articles on LinkedIn, and then he shared one of his own, which is also on his LinkedIn. And it was called An Open Letter to Business Leaders. Please embrace humanity. And I just absolutely love this article. In a more recent article he wrote about America, he wrote these words: I know what humanizing behavior looks like. It's uplifting, empowering, kind, compassionate, and constructive. I also know what dehumanizing behavior looks like. It's cruel, vindictive, petty, and destructive. Just want to pause there because one of them is power over and power under, and the other is power within and power between and power for one another. What I already knew about my guest is that he gets it, that how we use our power determines whether we create the conditions that lead to win-lose or win-win. And speaking with him in preparation for the show, I could see that we both recognize that most people want to create a world of shared power and win-win. But without prioritizing what it takes to fully embrace humanity, we fail to commit to and do the necessary work for expanding human potential and bringing out the best in one another. When Everyone Wins is a show about creating such a world so that all people experience healthy belonging and significance and feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing. By embracing humanity, we commit to help each other feel seen and safe and reassured in our place and in our relevance. Only then will we be able to create the uplifting, empowering, kind, compassionate, and constructive society that's described in my guest's article. So let me tell you about my guest. I was so positively impacted by his writing and the intelligence and heart with which he communicates that I invited him on the show. So meet Andy Prince. Andy Prince was born and raised in Puerto Rico. After graduating high school, he attended St. Edward's University in the United States and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in English and a minor in theology. He was going to be a priest. His time at St. Edward's fueled his interest and desire for social justice. He worked for an organization called Pax Christi, a nonprofit that was part of the Catholic Church, which was kind of like an Amnesty International with a Catholic faith base. This experience helped him become very aware of the many injustices in the world. And he found his passion for telling stories at Pax Christi, which led him to a career in communications. He's worked on clean energy issues with Green Mountain Energy Company, the Alliance for Retail Markets, and Porter Novelli. Later in his career, he crafted, built, and executed a highly successful strategic communications programs for mission-driven organizations. Andy currently provides consulting services to companies of all sizes looking to build human-based communications initiatives for both internal and external audiences. Additionally, he writes a weekly newsletter on being okay with being human, and he writes regularly on the topic of humanity. About 2 years ago, Andy and his wife moved to Bismarck, North Dakota from Austin, Texas, to be closer to her family as her parents age. They have 4 dogs and 1 cat. Welcome to the show, Andy Prince.
Thank you, Judy. I'm very excited to be here, and man, that guy sounds pretty cool. I'd like to meet him too.
He is pretty cool. I can vouch for that. So I love it that you're helping people get down to being real and being heart-centered and intelligent and heart-centered, caring for our humanity. And yet, in the articles that you wrote, one of the things that you point out is that we're so committed to, in the United States and other places in the world, to really hurt one another, to destroy and replace humans rather than uplift, empower, and support them. Why do you think that's happening? What are you seeing as the root causes?
Yeah, a lot of this conversation is going to come back to, unfortunately, is going to come back to greed, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, if you look at pre-World War II, right? If you look at the way the U.S., U.S. society kind of evolved prior to World War II, whenever there were conflicts that took place, the industries were activated, I guess, for using it would probably be the best term, were activated to support any sort of conflict or wartime situation that was taking place. But it wasn't a permanent activation, right? So these folks, there were citizen soldiers. The industries would come together. They would provide whatever they needed to support the war, but then they would go back to doing whatever manufacturing they were doing or agricultural issues that they were doing, right? A lot of the factories and things like that. World War II kind of changed it was sort of a seminal moment in terms of how we think about um, supporting the military, supporting defense, supporting basically the construction of what I would consider weapons of mass destruction, right? So World War II was the beginning of, if you, in the article I referenced the military industrial complex, right? And there's some great articles out there that go into pretty significant depth about what they are, but in a nutshell, World War II ushered in the military industrial complex in the United States in that a lot of these factories, that were prior used on a temporary basis became permanent, right? So there was a need to repurpose, retrofit, realign a lot of the industrial facilities in the United States to become, permanent places of construction to support, war. Um, and they were incredibly successful, right? They were hugely successful in doing so. But what it ended up creating was a military industrial complex, right? These were things that became entrenched, and it's really difficult to remove something that has been that entrenched and that relied upon, to support, the military and the industries that we have currently. Um, it was Eisenhower who was president at the time, and he warned against it, right? He warned against the rise of the military industrial complex and said, "Hey, look, this is certainly a look at the power of the people in this country to come together and do some amazing things." I mean, you know, the United States' ability to be an innovator and producer of such things was way behind in the world prior to World War II. At the end of World War II, and a 6 year, 5 to 6 year period became number one. I mean, that's incredible, right? That's just incredible ingenuity. That's an incredible coming togetherness of people all over this country to support this country in the way that it needed to be supported at the time. The unfortunate side effect, again, was the creation of the military industrial complex and our continued reliance on it, right? So it hasn't gone away. And what ended up happening, that's sort of a back history, but what ended up happening is you have a disproportionate amount of money spent on things like that, right? On things like the military and things that can destroy us as humans versus investments in education or versus investments in other things that can uplift humanity, right? And I want to make it clear that I don't have anything against the military. This is not an invective against the military. My dad served in World War II, and I'm very proud of him. My father-in-law was a Navy veteran during the Korean conflict, and I'm very proud of him. My uncle actually died in World War II and is buried in France. So this is not anything to do against the military or folks who served. And current folks serving and our veterans as well. I have nothing but respect for all those folks. However, a system was created that supports spending on military and weapons of destruction than it does on things that can uplift humanity. So that's sort of the root cause of how we've arrived where we've arrived, in terms of how we, apportion dollars to either support or not support humanity in this country.
Yeah, I really hear what you're saying. I think what I hear is here we had this innovative, collaborative experience together as America, but it was kind of conflated with the war machine, the
Yep.
military industrial complex. And I think that happens a lot of times, even when you think about all of the factories around that time and the mechanistic ways that we just wanted people to be kind of conforming, compliant factory workers.
Yep.
We associate a success with something that is actually not very helpful. And then on top of it, to prioritize the way we spend money, it kind of sets the tone for, I guess this is the way we're always going to go, unless somebody interrupts that and says, wait a minute, that worked for that scenario, but is it really the best way to proceed forward in the world? Or would we be better to take all of that innovation, collaboration, and money and use it in a different way that uplifts and supports? So yeah,
100%.
I don't see it about you being against the military as much as the conflagration of those things and where we started getting attached.
100%. 100%, right? And when you have something that does become a bit more permanent and entrenched, it's difficult to shift gears then, right? It makes it a challenge when you have these infrastructures in place and people are making money, right? I mean, the reality is people are making money. And when you challenge people's ability to make money, even if it's for something that doesn't support, uplifting behavior, when you challenge people's ability to make money, that causes problems, right? And then, well, what do you replace it with, and how do you, so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a, an interesting challenge in the U.S. that this is a culture that evolved, post World War II, during World War II, and post World War II, and we've been living with it for the last, how many ever years, right? 60, 70 years, since the end of World War II.
Yeah, it's really interesting as you're talking. I'm thinking about a bunch of words that start with the letter P. Like I always say, purpose and principles have to start preceding profit as being the priority. I know that sounds like I'm trying to say all of that, but when we think about power, that's another P word.
Yep.
We think about power is having to be the end all be all, and yet we're not using power in a way that is furthering purpose and principles in people. We're using it to, be profitable for many, many people. That's where the power starts being held until people start saying, as a collective, our values, who we are as people, what we want to cause one another is is more important than profit, because profit alone, what is it, there's a biblical saying, you can gain the whole world, but if you lose your love, you what's the point, kind of,
Right. You've lost it
basically
all. Yep.
you've lost it all. So I know this is kind of going in a darker focus here, but you had referenced in the article the doomsday clock and the impacts of artificial intelligence and climate change and the number of workers who want to leave their jobs. And it's interesting to me because when I think about those harmful impacts, I wonder, you know, how do we sustain hope and how do we help people to make that a priority and to start seeing the urgency? I mean, I see it as people aren't thinking long term, they're only thinking of short term. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think it is very much a short-term view, right? And there was something that happened back in the early 60s to today, right? So we talked a little bit about the creation of the military industrial complex and where we are with that today. But along those lines, when companies started, because there was a time, right? So just I'm going to sort of switch gears here for a moment and then come back. And this is the way I talk. So
That's
bear with me.
good.
I jump between ideas multiple times. But there was a time that capitalism was about uplifting humanity, right? There was a time when the focus and emphasis of capitalism was, giving people an opportunity to seek gainful employment and to, live a fulfilling life. And, it wasn't just about, well, I'm here on this farm. This is the way it's going to be for the rest of my life, and I'm never going to get out of whatever situation I'm in. There was a real sort of moral purpose behind capitalism. A moral objective behind capitalism in terms of uplifting people. And there was an evolution of that. I think what ended up happening, unfortunately, is, and it all ties back to what you asked, I promise. Um, I think unfortunately, so back in the 60s or in around 65, just as an FYI, right? The CEO to worker regular worker pay ratio was 21 to 1, right? So the CEO got paid maybe 21x more than the common worker, right? Now we're at about a 400 to 1. There was a peak period when it was about 1,000 to 1, right? And now we probably range somewhere in the 200 to 400 to 1 ratio in terms of CEO compensation versus the regular worker compensation. That creates a number of problems, right? From a human perspective, it creates a number of problems. You've suddenly elevated the CEO to more important than anybody else in the company, and you're scrambling as hard as you can to maintain that CEO, keep that CEO, or whatever the case may be, right? So you've already created a sense of imbalance by doing just that. You've made the CEO the most important person in the company versus the company, the people as a whole. Um, you are now put in a position where the priority becomes profitability over people. Because if you're going to pay that CEO and you have shareholders who are wanting to get some sort of return on that and their investment as a shareholder, you start looking at business from an efficiency and profitability standpoint versus what capitalism was really intended to do, is be an uplifting, bring people out of poverty or bring people into something new and a little bit different, right? So, for lack of a better term, capitalism jumped the shark at some point, and we are living it today, right? Where capitalism is much more about profitability and efficiency than it is about, people. Um, and that was not its original intent. The original intent of capitalism was very much about uplifting people. So, you know, where where did the darkness come in? I think you talked about the AI threat that we currently have and the doomsday clock that I referenced and all that. And I think a lot of the basis for it comes from the fact that there was sort of this flip in the 70s where CEOs started getting compensated much more money and they became the priority versus the people. And it just became a cultural thing, right? It sort of became, well, every company is going to start thinking this way. Every company wants to keep their CEO or pay their top executives or whatever the case may be. But it caused a mind shift as well, is part of the challenge, right? It wasn't just a compensation shift, it was a mind shift away from people and a mind shift toward money and profitability. And again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, let me just, I don't want to interrupt your thought process. So please finish. And then I have some things I'm writing down because you're stirring my own thoughts about all of this.
And again, this is not an invective against capitalism either, right? I think capitalism is amazing. I think this country is the most amazing country in the world. And I think the things that we have built in this country to uplift people are fantastic. But I do think that we have allowed systems to be established that have taken the focus off of people and put the focus on money over people, right? Or profitability over people, particularly in the business world. So that's it.
Yeah, well, to comment on that, I think one of those systems that were set up were financial rewards. Like you said, these huge financial rewards for not only the CEOs, but the stakeholders as well, were that focus. And in our work, we see those kinds of rewards as control systems. And what they do is they reduce the intrinsic motives for doing things. So the intrinsic motives for being a capitalist country originally were more focused on what you called the moral purpose. What are we creating all this for? But over time you lose sight of that. It reminds me of, I don't know if you know about Dan Price and Gravity. Gravity is a company that does credit card processing, and he
Yes.
looked at, do you know that story, how he looked at employees and found, and he did research and said that employees that make less than $70,000 are more focused on their own problems. Like, I don't have enough money to buy a house. I don't have enough money to get married or have a child. And so what he did was he made sure that every single person in his company made at least $70,000, even though he had to take it out of his own pocketbook, and I don't know if he had stock shareholders. And then he also required that none of the C-suite executives, including himself, could make more than 200 or four times which was like $280,000 or whatever.
Right.
So that,
Right.
and people got upset with him for that because they were so used to being rewarded and judged upon the money that they made. But what it did is it created so much more quality and success and that innovation and that collaboration that he desired, that people were doing a better job, and they had to keep moving their headquarters because they kept growing. And they even had more flexibility to help the communities that they moved into as a result. So he kind of got back to that moral purpose for capitalism. And yet he's considered kind of an outlier. So
Yeah.
I think what you're describing in this whole CEO thing is really the power over model, because it's just one of the control systems that is a power over control system. And it creates inferiority feelings in certain people and superiority feelings in certain people, which causes fear in everybody.
100%. And Ben and Jerry's did the same thing, right? Ben and Jerry, before they were acquired by, I don't remember who acquired them, Unilever or something, they did the same thing where their pay, right, as the CEOs and the founders couldn't be more than like 4 or 5x whatever the lowest paid employee was. So, they were trying to bring a sense of equity, at least in terms of pay, into the organization, which I applaud, which I think is great. And I mean, they were incredibly successful, right? They were phenomenally successful at the work that they did.
Yeah, and it's really, and this is an aside, but in life work systems, when we go in and we bring a shared power model, one of the hardest things that we have to overcome is that the leaders are expected to fraternize with all the different levels in the culture change process. And they don't always like that. They're like, no, can't we just stay separate and above it all? They don't use those words, but
Right.
there's a vulnerability in saying, I'm just like you, and you and I have the same kind of needs, and maybe I have a little more responsibility, so I should make a little more money, but I'm in this with you, and I care about you as much as I expect you to care about me. That's missing largely in a lot of organizations.
A
I
hundred, 100%, right? And sometimes there are obvious statements, right? But there are times that there are, I don't know if the right term for this is a microaggression, but unintentional sharing of information that can show that inequity. So, for example, and I'll give you an example, I worked with a company where the CEO is doing a presentation to, it was a company-wide presentation, a all hands meeting. And one of the slides that he had was him in his sailboat, right?
mm,
And it's like how disconnected from reality, right? Or how
right,
disconnected from the rest of your company can you actually be that you're showing yourself on, this amazing yacht, which you obviously were able to afford because of the compensation that you're receiving through this company, right? And it really upset a lot of folks in the company, and understandably so. They're like, He doesn't understand what I'm going through. He has no idea, right?" So there are even he may have been trying to make a point with the sailboat, but unintentionally what he communicated was, "I'm up here and you're not," right?
right. Or that success is acquisition, not compassion, kindness, mutual support,
Yep.
teamwork, all of those things. I'm kind of this rugged individual that has been successful, and this is what you all should aspire to. And it takes away people's sense of meaning if it's all about money.
Yep.
So, how do we help leaders really become aware of and prioritize humanity?
Yeah, so I did a post on LinkedIn not too long ago, very short one that was more money focused, right? So I think sometimes when you're dealing with leaders, if you speak in their language, especially CEOs, right? They're used to dealing with boards or having things communicated to them in terms of dollars and efficiency. And I found a place to start, at least with some of the leaders that I've worked with, is exactly that, speaking in their language. So let me give you an example. There are the in the US alone, there is about 450 to 550 billion dollars lost in productivity annually by because of employee disengagement,
Mhm.
right? So the average salary in the US is about $66,000. And the assumption is that, there's something between 18 to, let's just say 18 to 30%, right? Of an employee's salary is lost if they're disengaged, right? So if you make 66,000, 18% is around $11,000 a year. That's one employee. So if you have 10 disengaged employees, you're talking now, in the 120,000. If you have 20 disengaged, you see where I'm going, right?
Yeah.
This just goes up and up and up and up. So if you look at it from that perspective, from a true productivity and investment perspective and dollars perspective, if you are not making an investment in people, you are losing. And even scarier than that, again, me changing directions in the middle of a thought. Even scarier than that, if you also look at, and these are numbers that I'm not making up, these are actual numbers that exist out there in the world, that something like 33% of employees are actually engaged in their companies at the moment, right? Fully engaged. So 67, 66, 65% of employees are not engaged at $66,000 a piece, and 18% of that is lost. You're talking millions and millions of dollars here, right? Millions of dollars.
Andy, we use those statistics as well, and we talk about how even in that 65%, there's a smaller percentage, about 15 to 20%, that can be actively disengaged, where they're causing all kinds of problems
Yep,
that are not only losing money, but like drastically costing the company in reputation and
yep,
losses and all kinds of theft and all that kind of stuff. And those 30 to 33% that are highly engaged, they know they can move on. So
yep,
they're typically bringing in at least 30 to $40,000 a year by the gifts and talents that they're using.
yep,
So between, even just like our figures are probably a little behind right now, but even with 100 people in a typical company, that's more than $1 million for every 100 that's lost every year. I think the
100%.
sad part is that we have to appeal through that capitalistic profitability mindset. And for us, the only way that people start coming more into the humanity is to be in the same room with one another, sharing from a vulnerable place. And I don't mean sharing like spilling your guts, but being able to learn new skills together that are not typically understood, or new concepts, new strategies, peer mentoring and reverse mentoring, which causes people to stop ignoring the people that are making $66,000 a year,
Right.
if that, or less.
Yeah, agree. And to me, this is just to get some of these leaders to the table, right? This is just to begin the conversation, to frame it in their language, to understand the impact on their business. Because, you turn around and invest $100,000 in an engagement program, right? 100,000 for the year in an engagement program, and you get 10 people to re-engage, you've already paid for the program, right? You get 20 people to engage, you've paid for it many times over. And
Yes.
then the ongoing effects of that are significant, right? But to me, as far as leaders go, I think sometimes it is meeting people where they are, right? And having them understand the impact on their business. And then to your point, it's once you then like, fine, okay, I get it. We're going to commit to this. You invest in the tools, you invest in the people, you invest in the programs that you need to invest in. Then I think you do start having walls being broken down and you do start having those vulnerable moments and you do start having, holy crap, I didn't realize you guys were even struggling with that. Man, I'm glad to hear because I didn't know. I didn't know that was a problem that we were having in our company, right? And you start having other discussions and conversations that then lead to what I would consider a true transformation of an organization, right?
Yeah.
That is about respect, mutual respect, and supporting people and things like that. But unfortunately, yeah, sometimes you do have to start with the money.
I am completely in agreement. That's why we use those same kind of statistics. But it is sad. It's a sad commentary that
It is.
we've so taught leaders to close their hearts. I remember one time I was working with a female leader that had risen through her company, and she met with me, and we spent hours together. And she talked about all the people beneath her now in the chain of command and how much she could see what they needed from her. But when I challenged her to, change the systems, she was really unwilling to because she had kind of been guided by somebody that taught her to step on the backs of other people to get to where she'd gotten. And she knew that she had quote unquote arrived, even though she was unhappy about what it was costing the people beneath her. And yet she was not willing to step off of that place of I've arrived. And so it's kind of hard for people that are used to doing power over to set that aside and believe that they're going to be okay, and not even only okay, but better for it.
So along those lines, what I have also discovered in terms of having these conversations, and one of the hardest ones to have because the numbers are, it's hard data and you can, show numbers and all of that. But the biggest transition, in my opinion, that needs to happen with leadership to embrace something like this and to do something like this is emotional intelligence.
Mhm.
And and what I mean by that is you have to admit you're wrong, maybe, or you have to admit that maybe you don't know exactly what you're doing, right? That there's something going on within your organization. And I get it. If you're at that level, there's a certain level of ego that comes with being a CEO or a VP or whatever the case may be, right? I get it. Um, but you have to be willing to say, maybe this is outside my area of expertise. Maybe I just don't know what I'm doing. And I think if you can reach that level of emotional intelligence where you can step back and go, this isn't about me necessarily. I may not have created this culture, but I let this culture happen. And I didn't do anything to redirect it or stop it or enforce something that was a lot more, enforce isn't the right word, but provide a place where people could feel safe to be who they are. I didn't intentionally create this, but I created it or I let it be created. And now I need to step back and go, you know what? I need some help. I really
Yeah.
do need some help. And I think that's the biggest challenge. I mean, you talked about the woman who was used to stepping on backs of people. I mean, there's a bit of self-reflection, right? And a bit of a holy shit moment of coming to grips with the fact that, maybe this is what I did. Maybe this is how I acted. Maybe this is how I functioned to get to where I am and this is not okay, right? And I think that's one of the big challenges is just having people come to an acceptance that, maybe they actually do need some outside perspective or even inside perspective or whatever it is on changing how the culture is set up and how relationships actually work within the organization.
It's such a circular challenge because there's so much of belief in rewards and punishment that people think if I look at something that isn't working and I acknowledge it, then I'm going to get in trouble. Even
Yeah.
high level executives. And so that self-awareness is hard to look at because what if I see something that I don't like about myself? We use a quote. I'm trying to think of who wrote it. I can't think of the name of the person offhand, but it was about change blindness. And it said that to really change is difficult because we have to go out of our way to change. First of all, we have to be willing to say, oh, this system doesn't work, we better disassemble it. Well, what do we put in its place? but also the idea that the way we've been thinking could be outdated. It does not mean we are outdated, but the way we're thinking. And I try to liken it when I talk about that quote, I try to liken it to, we're not ashamed that we have to upgrade our phones or our computer systems or our cars, but we're so ashamed if we have to update our human systems. And that's kind of silly. And it's very, it causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. You talked about emotional intelligence. And it reminded me of how these two women wrote a book about the power code, which is very aligned with my work about what I'm describing in this show, shifting power over and power under to power within and power between. And it was why so many women are not in these positions of authority, because they don't like using power over. And I know this woman I just talked about definitely had accepted power over, but in
Right, right.
general, it's a more male dominated kind of way of thinking. I can see, Andy, you don't think that way as a male, but a lot of the way that our ethos is in our society is that power is climbing to the top, and it is power over. It's not power within and power between and power for one another. So I do think it is a self-awareness and self-managing an emotional intelligence set of skills.
Yeah,
So thoughts on
agree.
that?
Agree 100%, right? And I think there's something, to step away from business for a moment and just to get into the psychology of it all. Belief systems are powerful things. And most belief systems are human manufactured, right? That we create these belief systems, but they're the things that prop us up and give us our identity so much of the time. And if all of a sudden we realize that this belief system we've had needs to be disassembled or needs to be torn down or needs to be, you know, recalibrated, whatever, term we want to use, that can be life-shattering, right? That can be truly life-shattering because so much of our identity is tied up in that belief system. And if you have to undo that, you're kind of undoing a part of yourself, right? But I think that's where that whole having the level of emotion and intelligence, can't even say the word, the level of emotional intelligence that's so critical, is to be able to go, you know what? It's okay if I have to disassemble this, right? I'm going to assemble something new and better. You know, there's
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in the word yet, right? I think yet is such a powerful word. And Carol Dweck, if you've ever read any of her stuff and, about mindset and growth and all that. But, I've heard CEOs go, well, we can't do that. Well, maybe we say we can't do that yet.
Hmm.
Well, we can't spend the money to do blah, blah, blah. Well, we can't spend the money to do blah, blah, blah yet, right? If that yet at the end keeps options open for anything, Andy, I can't think of a new, I can't, holy crap, this is going to be so hard for me. I'm going to be embarrassed if I have to come out and do this. And it makes it look like I'm a loser or I wasn't doing something or I was, whatever, I failed in whatever I did. And it's like, no, no, that's not what this is about, right? You just haven't achieved the culture that you want yet,
Right.
right?
And a lot of it is not even because you didn't want to, it's because you didn't have the information to.
The
We're so
skills
hard
to.
on ourselves because we think we're supposed to know this new innovative way to do something when it's never been exposed, people have not been exposed to it. And I really get what you're saying about how people's identity gets wrapped up in it. That's what I was saying about this woman leader. She had her identity wrapped up in, but I've gotten here and I finally got here and I'm one of the few that got here. And her identity was so tied up that she literally could not at that time open her heart to doing something that she knew was loving, that was moving
Yeah.
her in the direction that her heart wanted her to go. And so I do think what has to happen personally, and you can tell me your thoughts on this, um, I think it requires a certain number of visionary people that see beyond what's here now and know that it could be better, and they're not as risk averse to trying something different, and then they go out and they do this different thing and they have a success, and then people can say, this is a ship I can jump off of into this ship because I know that it's sound, but if they don't see that, they're afraid to jump from what they know already, even if it's kind of like a ship that's leaking and sinking. They'll still hang on to it.
The devil you know, right? The devil
The
you know
devil you
versus
know.
The
The
devil
devil
you
you
know.
know. Yeah.
You touched on something really important, and it's a term that I've heard that really resonates with me, right? About taking a chance. Courage is contagious,
Hmm.
right? And if you see somebody do something, and I've learned this lesson, and I was fortunate, as I grew in my career, toward the end of my career, I've always been very direct and outspoken with the executives in companies where I worked, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Sometimes it got me in trouble, but most of the time it didn't. It was appreciated. But what I discovered is, as I was sitting in a room thinking, I may be the only person thinking this, the reality is I'm not. Other people are just afraid to say it. And
Right.
when one person says it, it can change everything, right? If one person has the courage to go, something's not quite right here, you're probably going to get at least five other voices going, you know what? I was thinking the same thing. I was wondering about that too. And suddenly it becomes something very different, right? The energy changes, the mood changes, the thinking changes, and it's sort of a flashpoint. It's obviously you still have to invest in the tools and the time and, make everything happen. But I'm a big believer in courage is contagious. And there are probably a lot of other people within an organization that think exactly the same way, you know, X, Y, or Z person does, but it's going to take that one person to say something to get everybody else to jump on board.
I love that. And I do agree, courage is contagious, and it's important to focus on the courage and not the fear. Also, I think even when you are courageous and somebody combats it with a different perspective, that is also in the room. So, well, yeah, but what about this? And sometimes that can lead to a good conversation. Like we teach this story that you know about where we talk about this eighth grader that had to go and decided he was for peace, and he wanted to go to his homeroom teacher and have a kind of a honest, authentic conversation with her about kind of control in a very healthy way. And people would say to me, why would you tell an eighth grader to go confront, a
Right?
teacher? And that happened in a group. And I said, well, do we want them to confront a teacher with peace? Is that an okay confrontation? And also, this child is eighth grader. He's going to be going to college in 4 years. Do we want him to be prepared through his own experience of success to have a conversation with an authority figure without cowing and being afraid? And that conversation led to, yeah, you're right, what are we preparing people for if we're keeping them stuck in a power under position?
Yep.
So you're right, it's courage is contagious. I'm going to keep that in mind because change is scary, so you have to grab
Change
your
is
courage.
scary.
Yes.
Change is scary as hell, right? Any change that we go through, we're stepping into the unknown, right? In many ways. And sure, it could be better, but we're stepping into the unknown. And fear, fear is one of those things that it's a very powerful thing, right? And we have rational fear, right? And rational fear is a human condition has kept us alive, right? It's kept us over the years alive from doing maybe some stupid things that we might have if we didn't have fear at all, right? Rational fear. I'm talking about rational fear. But then there's irrational fear, right? And I've heard, by the way, I've heard a lot of people say, well, you have a real fear, like rational fear, and irrational fear is not real. Well, no, it is. Irrational fear is very real, right? If you've talked to anybody who's been debilitated by getting on an elevator, that fear is very real. It may be irrational, but it's very real, right?
Yeah.
And I think even taking some time to understand the motivators or what the drivers are to our irrational fear, and then dissecting that and looking at it and thinking, can this really harm me? Right? Because that's what fear is. It's a fear that we're going to get hurt or harmed. But if you dissect an irrational fear and you start to realize that this isn't, this really can't do anything to me. Why am I being irrational about it? Right? And it's a
Yeah.
process and it takes time,
Well,
but
you land upon something very important, because I know when we go in and do culture transformation, we emphasize the importance of shifting the mindset first. Because if you
yes,
don't, and for me, when you're talking about fear and the irrational fear, and how it's still very real, we do that over the use of power. We show that if you use these power tactics. We have four main ones. You're thinking fearful, limiting beliefs about people when you're using them, and you're
Yes.
cultivating really negative behavior in people, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. Even if they look like brown nosers and people pleasers, and they look like they're running for the door to do the job because they're going to get the reward or whatever, we have to show them the fearfulness in the things they're already doing so that they start feeling the fear of that
Yeah.
and want to let go of it. Adler called that spitting in the soup. That means you take something that people are attached to that is actually quite harmful, but they think it's so wholesome. And if you spit in it, they're not going to think it's so wholesome anymore. So I think that's what you're kind of describing,
Yep.
which really, you know, my thought about this with you and my question to you is, how do we get leaders? What are other ways you've seen that we help leaders realize this is not just a nice to have to make people and principles and culture and power within and power between? How do we make that a need to have, not a nice to have? What do you think should be happening to help the leaders really prioritize it, not only for the survival of their companies, but their survival in our world?
Here's the million-dollar question right here. This is a big one, right? It's multiple things, right? There's not that one thing that is going to flip a switch. I mean, it may for some people, right? But by and large, there's not one thing that's going to flip a switch. I think part of it, at least from a company perspective, right, a business perspective, a part of it is thinking about the leader that you want to be, right? And even writing it down, writing it down. If I were the best leader, what would that look like? And there's something about putting pen to paper that makes it real, and then do some very thorough self-analysis and self-examination and go, how many of these am I living up to? Am I living up to any of them? Am I not? If I'm not, what can I do to change to become more of this, right? So I think on a personal level, there needs to be some self-reflection from leaders in terms of understanding, what they might be doing, what they could be doing to improve themselves as a leader. And I use the word, and you too, intentionally use the word leader, not manager, right?
Mhm.
Manager is a whole different thing. Um, I think, I think looking at having some very hard looks at the business and the impacts on the business can open some eyes too. There are people who just look at everything through a lens of numbers, right? Well, if your productivity is down and you guys do an employee survey and you find that, 60% of your employees are disengaged, that's a problem and that's an area that you need to invest in, right? So listen to your people. I mean, this is going back. Richard Branson used to say it all the time, right? Listen to your people. Listen to what your people are telling you. They know better than you do what's happening in the business. Um, so what do, right? If you have a 60% disengagement rate, well, that's reflective of maybe not you personally, but it's reflective of what's happening in the company. So what are you going to do about it, right? So listen to your people, put surveys and instruments in place to actually provide real feedback and listen to what people are saying. That's a starting point, not an ending point, right? Starting point is you find that out. Well, then you dig in deeper to understand what and why, and you build programs to address that. Um, I think look at your attrition rates. I mean, again, looking at it just from a business perspective, what are your attrition rates? Are you losing people? Are you losing good people? And if so, why? Why, go to HR and see if you can look at attrition rates. I think once you start being willing to do that, that's part of that mindset shift of being open to it. I think it becomes really interesting to me. I think for a lot of leaders, it then becomes a journey of discovery of, well, am I doing this in my own personal life? Are there things in my personal life that I could be thinking about differently or doing differently? How's my communication with my wife? How's my communication with my siblings and my family? How's my communication with, my friends and neighbors? I mean, are there things, it sort of starts to become a subconscious thing where you start thinking about these things in a different way, which, then, sort of lends itself to having a different worldview as well, right? But
Yeah,
it's, it's,
yeah.
it's got to start. in the very practical. Unfortunately, it has to be fairly practical when you start looking at this idea of change. And then the practical starts to become much more altruistic. And I've seen it happen with people, right? Where they're like, holy shit, I didn't realize I was doing this or saying this or, all of these things. And, now I'm even having a different conversation with my wife at home about a problem that
Exactly.
we've had. And I've used this technique that I learned at work around communication to sit down and go, hey, let's kind of work through this. And then when we did, it was like, oh my God, we discovered that it was the dumbest thing in the whole world that we were disagreeing about and, things like that. So I think it goes from the practical to the altruistic, but I think for a lot of businesses, it has to start at the practical.
You've said so many important things in this whole last thing you just said. You talked a lot about intentionality, about a leader looking at who do they want to be. And we always start a little bit even before that, because who do we want to be is my values. What kind of behaviors and ways of being do I want to show up with? But the Simon Sinek would say the why is what we want to cause.
Yes.
And
Yes.
people are uncomfortable with that because it feels so lofty. We're afraid of saying we're that powerful. And
Yeah.
we have this program within our culture change process. It's called the blueprint process. And it used to be in month 4. We got more pushback from everybody on that month. We put it to the end and then we put it to the first slot. Because if you don't get clear about what you're here to cause, my company purpose is to create a world where all people love their lives. And yet I've had marketing people say, oh, you can't say that. Company owners don't care if people love their lives. And I'm like, well, I don't want to work with them then. You know,
Right.
and when you listen to your people, you said people need to listen to their people. It's only then that you stop being separate from them. It's
Yep.
only then that you start saying we're in this together. And you're also saying that people have got to look at the impacts, not judge themselves for it. But the thing we always say is don't ask, why is this happening and who's to blame? Ask what system, if it were put in place, would fix this.
Yep.
And it made
100%.
me think, as you were talking, it made me think about our United States for sure. And a lot of the world is in a crisis right now. So if we don't
100%.
start looking practically at what's happening, we're going to self-destruct, just like an
Yeah.
alcoholic or something. If we don't hit bottom and realize it and get out of our denial, we're in trouble.
We are in trouble, 100%. And there's a concept. It was, I think, Charlie Munger. How do you say his name? The Berkshire Hathaway guy, the one that worked with what's his name? Warren Buffett. But he had this concept called first principles, where you take anything and you break it down into its simplest elements, and then from there you can reconstruct, right? And I love the idea of that from a philosophical perspective because it's not just about, mechanical things, right? It's about anything. It's about even within a company and a culture, you can take the culture all the way down to its core principles, to its simplest principles, an exercise that you can do to understand, oh, this is the piece, right? Here are 8 pieces we can keep, but these 3 pieces have been causing, some issues, or we need to spend some time. So that way you don't have to completely revamp an entire culture and throw everything out, right? Because for a lot of companies, I suspect there are some things that are good and some things that need improvement. And it's that idea of being able to, take apart something and look at it at its core and understand where, some issues may be, and then reassembling it into something different can be incredibly powerful. But, I found the philosophy of first principles incredibly powerful because it also, I think for a lot of leaders, they want to look at the world through a logical lens as well, right? This sort of in the heart, feel good kind of stuff can be, difficult to do. But I think if some of it can be framed in, in terms of like a first principles concept, which a lot of, leaders understand, or the practical concept, like we talked about, right, of looking at the impact on your business and then, growing in emotional intelligence from there.
Andy, I feel like I could talk to you all day long. I felt that way when we talked to you recently, and I love your writings. I encourage all of our listeners to go look at your ongoing newsletter and blog and your articles on LinkedIn and look you up and connect with you, because you are a person that has been embracing humanity. You are a very manly man. So you're a great witness for being head and heart. Feelings and intellect. And I just hope that, today's message is something that our audience takes away saying, oh, how can I embrace humanity? And no, it doesn't mean I have to lose my intellectual mind in the process.
Not at all.
So that, because right now that's the crucial shift. And if we
Yep.
don't, we're going to continue to see so much unnecessary suffering. And if
Yep.
and if we do embrace humanity, we're going to be able to start creating the power within, the power between, and the power for one another, not against one another. And that's going to be a world where we can all win. And so I just want to thank you so much for being a representative of power within and power between, and helping us to see how possible it is to make this crucial shift that we need to make right now. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thank you, Judy. This has been awesome.
You've been listening to When Everyone Wins, where we're shifting power over and under to power within and between. I'm Judy Ryan, your transformation talk radio host. Tune in each second and fourth Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time to learn new concepts and tools and listen to conversations I have with thought leaders and change agents. You'll also see real-world applications of what I'm covering so that you experience the power of the concepts and tools I share. In each episode, I bring you my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWorks Systems. I invite you to call in with your unique stories and questions. The path to ensure that everyone wins depends on our ability as people to create a life we love and help others do the same. For more information, visit lifeworksystems.com.